Greetings, Swagger Sticks, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
As the new Codex is on the horizon / has just been released, delete as appropriate, we thought we'd take a look at an old Imperial Guard Codex.
The Imperial Guard, otherwise known as the Astra Militarum, or Imperial Army depending on what decade we're in, are the backbone of the Imperial forces, representing the regular human soldier on the battlefields of the far future of Warhammer 40,000, a squishier and more relatable counterpoint to the gene-forged walking tanks that are the Astartes. In their original 1st edition Imperial Army form, they were more or less just generic sci-fi soldiers, and since there's a lot of 2000 AD comics inspiration in 40k, we can't help but notice a similarity in the Imperial Army armour designs to Johnny Alpha's armour. These dogs are at least a little strontium.
By 2nd edition, they had diversified into many variant regiments hailing from different corners of the Imperium, largely based on real-world historical militaries. Not shocking the Perry twins were behind most of those minis, they do love their historicals. This trend would continue into 3rd edition, which is where the book we'll be looking at today comes from. 1999's Codex Imperial Guard is another 3rd edition codex that would be replaced by a new book later in the edition. However, since that second one came out in 2003, and they didn't get a new book until 5th edition, I suppose you could consider that second one just a 4th edition codex that came out a teensy bit early. Regardless, we're looking at the first one right now, which was written by Jervis Johnson and Gav Thorpe, with cover art by David Gallagher. A cover which feels much more 20th century warfare than the more fantastical stuff we usually see from Gallagher in this series, leaving the little details like this crucified bloke to remind you... Yep! This is 40k!
The book opens on a very tone-setting in-universe introduction.
Call yourself a guardsman, you horrid little specimen! Newly recruited, still wet behind the ears, and you think you know it all already. Well, let me tell you, recruit, you don't know nothing. Not yet, anyway. Read this training manual, though, and you'll learn the basics. The rest can only be learnt the hard way, in the glory of battle. So eyes, front, shoulders back, stomach in! That's it. Stand tall, recruit. Show some pride, 'cause you're in the Imperial Guard now.
And we do appreciate how the Why Collect Imperial Guard section here did at least acknowledge that collecting an Imperial Guard army with its massed infantry, which was made almost entirely from metal at the time, was a big commitment. It also assures us that, although the list in this book is really only for infantry-based guard armies, they would probably be releasing variant lists in the future for other kinds of armies, which, they basically did, so, good for them. As is normal for a codex of this era, the thing was fairly light on fluff compared to modern books, or even the books from the previous edition for that matter. But what there was interesting. It starts by describing 6 of the more well-known Imperial Guard regiments. There was the well-trained and supplied Cadian shock troops, the World War II Soviet-themed Valhallan Ice Warriors, the Catachan Jungle Fighters, an army of John Rambos, the dour Mordian Guard who enter battle in their blue dress uniform and live on a planet that doesn't rotate, so one side is always day and the other side is always night. Which wouldn't happen, from what I understand. To have that kind of orbit, it would have to rotate. Our moon is tidally locked to us, and it rotates once per orbit. Those things are in sync, that's why we only see one side of it. So a planet that didn't rotate would have a day-night cycle, it'd just be a really, really long one that takes an entire year to complete. That might seem like needless pedantry, and on some level it definitely is, but they actually described Mordia as rotating once per orbit so that one side of it always faces the sun in the 2nd edition codex. So they got it right here, and then they just mucked it up when they tried to explain it again later.
Then there's the Tal'an Desert Raiders, who've got an Arab revolt / Mujahideen thing going on, and come from a planet that was once nice, but virus bombs, several invasions, and a demon incursion have made it into a much less nice place. Finally, there's the Attilan Rough Riders, based on Mongolian cavalry. Although unlike the other regiments here, you can't make a whole army of them as they are only represented by a single unit. But that's not all the regiments that were shown. There's also a couple of pages later on that list so many more with little accompanying sketches. Some of these were or have later become more well known, and some have even had their own mini-lines, like the "We watched Zulu too many times Praetorian Guard," or the "Everyone from World War I in the blender Death Corps of Krieg." But plenty of them don't really exist outside these pages. I'm sure any of you who are really into military history will notice dozens of little references and homages to various historical militaries. But since that's not our strong suit, we'll just once again bring up the Woad Warriors of Tangar, who appear to go into battle buck-ass naked and have a reference to the band Clan of Zymox in there for reasons that I'm sure make sense if you're more into Dutch darkwave music than we are. Honestly, these couple of pages are fantastic if for nothing else than inspiring players to get a little bit wild with their armies. Sure, you could collect Cadians, but these pages are practically challenging you to bust out the green stuff and make something unique.
Of the other bits and pieces of fluff, the last one we want to highlight is a letter written by a new guardsman named Damek to his brother Sebastian back on the farm, complete with redacted information as is the style of such correspondence. It goes over the scale and speed at which new guardsmen are trained, mostly, it seems, on the ships on the way to a war zone. You are told of the broken and battered regiments they'll be replacing, and you realise how propaganda has played a role in how they perceive their lot. There's excitement and pride in his words, even as the scale of death in the conflict he's heading into is hinted at. It's a very humanising bit of fiction. If you've ever read anything by soldiers from one of the world wars, then this will feel very familiar. It's all a big adventure in the beginning, get out there and show those baddies what for. But you don't need to be told what happened to Damek next. You already know. Moving on to the army list, the first thing to mention is platoons. So 3rd edition used this version of the force organisational chart, meaning that for most games you needed at least 1 HQ choice and 2 troops choices to make a legal army. The Guard had what I can only describe as a fractal organisational chart. That is to say that, for example, when you took an infantry platoon as a troops choice, it was effectively a small army of independent squads in and of itself that had its own force organisation. At its most basic, an infantry platoon was 1 5-man command section and 2 10-man infantry squads. Sound familiar? But could be supplemented by 3 more infantry squads, so a single troops choice could be 6 independent squads and number 55 miniatures. Platoons weren't actually that complicated really, and were just there to represent the very structured way in which the Imperial Guard is organised, plus it was kind of riffing on a thing they'd done in 2nd edition. But it did make the minimum amount of miniatures required to run a guard army at this time kinda big, and I remember looking at this structure in the 3rd edition main rulebook and having my eyes glaze over a little bit and going, yeah, maybe I won't do guard.
Anyway, on to the list itself. HQ choices were pretty slim with only command platoons and commissars. And one of those doesn't even really count. The command platoons were mandatory and the command HQ would be led by either a captain or a colonel and their 4 guardsmen companions, who could be equipped in many different ways depending on how you want to use them. Like the guardsmen could all have flamers and the colonel a combi flamer, if you really wanted to find out how many flamethrowers would be considered a war crime. You do you. This is on top of the usual command squad stuff, like having a standard bearer and the like. And of course, since it's a platoon, there's other squads that can be in there. Heavy weapons squads specifically. Plus a sentinel unit that could be also attached to it, but isn't a part of the list here for reasons I'm sure made sense at the time. As a fun experiment, we thought we'd see how many points it was possible to spend on a single command platoon if you took every possible, most expensive upgrade. It's somewhere in the region of 1,350 points, which, for context, is the same as nearly 11 of the cheapest Lehman Russes. Commissars were, thankfully, much simpler and you could have 5 of them in an army. Although they didn't actually count as an HQ choice, they're just listed with them. Commissars were attached to squads with officers in them, and had to do so in order of rank. So if you only had 1, they'd have to be attached to the command HQ, and if you had more, they'd accompany other squads with officers in them. If a unit with a commissar failed a morale test, the commissar would execute the officer, allowing the unit to attempt to regroup using his leadership stat, even if they wouldn't normally be able to do so. If the attempt failed, then the squad buggered off, fragging the commissar on the way out. As you do.
For elites, you had up to 1 squad of hardened veterans. They could have a lot of unusual wargear options like shotguns or a sniper rifle, as well as stormtroopers, who are what Tempestus Scions were before Tempestus Scions were a thing, Ogrins, whose minis looked far more orcish than now, and up to one squad of rattling snipers. For troops, you had the slightly convoluted infantry platoons mentioned earlier, but for every infantry platoon you could also take an armoured fist squad as a troop's choice, which were just 10 guardsmen in a chimera. Fast attack was Hellhounds, Sentinels and Rough Riders, and heavy support was just so many Leman Russ variants. I know there's so many in the current game that they basically give you half of an entire extra Russ in the box, but even in 1999 there were already 4 of them. The main battle tank, the Vanquisher, the Exterminator and the Demolisher. I suppose at least I don't have the trouble of trying to remember which one is the Leman Russ Exterminator and which one is the Leman Russ Executioner, because one of them isn't here. I know one's the autocannon guy and one's the plasma guy, but unless I have it written down dead in front of me, I cannot remember which one is which. Heavy support was rounded out with Basilisks and Griffins. Griffins have been gone from guard codexes for a while, but they were basically a big mortar strapped to a Chimera chassis. Oh, and speaking of things based on Chimera chassis, there were also your transport options, which were... oh, okay, well, they were just Chimeras.
There's not a huge amount we want to talk about on the wargear front, but there was the Targeter, which allowed that model to pre-measure the range of a target, as that wasn't a thing you could normally do in 3rd edition. And in fact, once you used the Targeter, any units with guessed range weapons couldn't be used for the rest of the turn to prevent you gaining an advantage. And I assumed that they figured people would complain about that, so they left a note explicitly telling you that that's why they did it. The crew escape mechanism was an upgrade that you could take on Russes that would mean that, upon the destruction of the vehicle, some of the crew would survive. This was represented by D3 crew minis being placed down next to the destroyed Russ. These used guardsman rules and didn't earn your opponent victory points for killing them, but the vehicle wouldn't count as being fully destroyed until they were dead either. Also, I suppose it was a novel opportunity to model some guardsmen as tank crews. Finally, there's the trademark item, which we're mentioning not because of what it did, it just allowed the squad of whoever had it to reroll failed morale or pinning tests since it reassured them, but for how the trademark item is described. This is something the character carries into battle to show his disregard for the enemy. It could be a swagger stick or a nonchalantly smoked cigar, or something more grandiose like a billowing scarlet cape, or a chest full of shiny medals. And that was just a 5-point upgrade. It really was just incentivizing you to customize your officers, to make them unique, to make them into actual characters that you have backstories for and therefore care about. I know I'd be more invested in not losing Lieutenant Montgomery Tiberius Smythe and his trademark uncomfortably large hat to enemy fire than some random bludger who just happens to be an officer in my guardsman unit.
And on the subject of characters, this book did, of course, have some of the special variety. Lord Commander Solar Macarius was the first, and he was basically Alexander the Great in 28mm heroic scale. He could lead a guard army of 2,000 points or more and had some interesting rules, like how an injury received in a previous campaign meant that a couple of his stats had to be rolled for. You know, he had his good days and his bad days. And in any game where you rolled off to decide who went first, an army led by him could just pick whether they wanted to go first or not, on account of his master strategering. There was Commissar Yarrick, whose art I quite like since it's based on the 2nd edition mini, but in the more grounded style of post-2nd ed. And I can't be the only one who liked it, since the art showed up in the next few guard codices, even though he had a new mini with a totally different claw by then.
Yarrick also had some neat rules, like his force field that, rather than doing something normal and boring like giving him an invulnerable save, meant he reduced the strength of attacks against him by d6, stopping them entirely if they reached strength 0. His Iron Will rule also worked differently to how other characters generally did it. It's another one of those rules to represent how a character is very hard to kill, and if you try, he might just get back up again. This one meant that when he was killed, you'd place his mini on its side, and in the next guard turn you'd roll a d6, and on a 4+, he'd just get back up with 1 wound. There were no restrictions to how often he could do this. You could kill him every turn, and if your opponent rolled well, he could just get back up every time. The fiction attached to him was also fun, since it's Yarrick's nemesis Gazkul yelling at an underling about him. showing that Gaz believes Yarrick, like all great opponents of the Orcs, is blessed by Gork and Mork to provide them with a worthy foe to make them better warriors. Next, we had Nork Deadog, the Ogryn bodyguard who, being incredibly loyal, would throw himself in front of the officer in any Command HQ squad he was attached to. His bit of fiction, also repeated from the 2nd Ed Guard Codex, is great since it's him trying to help his injured commander. The Ogryn fumbled with his water bottle, breaking off the cap with clumsy hands as he gently preferred the bottle to the man's lips. Grace murmured as the cool water splashed over his face. "Nork," he whispered, "stop trying to drown me and fetch the medipack." "Yus, sir," shouted Nork, saluting instinctively with his left hand, then his right hand, and then both hands together. The image of Nork doing this is gonna stick with me. It's very Arnold Rimmer. Finally, we have Colonel Schaefer's last chances. We mentioned these way back in 2018 when we covered one of the old chapter approved books, but we barely mentioned anything about them. They're the special 13th Penal Legion used only for the most dangerous of missions. You could say they're some kind of suicide squad.
Apart from Schaefer himself, the last chances all shared a stat line, but each member was given unique equipment and are just known by nicknames, although some are given proper names in the short attached story. Interestingly, we are told what diabolical crimes each committed to end up here, like murdering 20 people or breaking into the Colonel's drink cabinet. 2 crimes of equal severity, I'm sure we can all agree. Although Grease Monkeys is the funniest since he ended up as a last chancer by stealing an Eldar grav vehicle from an Eandan ambassador. Look, he saw his chance for a once-in-a-lifetime joyride and he took it. No judgment from me. The colour section began like most 3rd edition colour sections, with examples of how to start an army, showing you a bunch of the units, demonstrating tactics you could use, and showing you variant paint schemes for different regiments. In this case, complete with handy squares demonstrating how their camo patterns work. Also, I just want to highlight this army photo because I remember looking at this thing in the 3rd edition rulebook as a teenager, and it seeming like an impossibly large army. Nobody needs that many minis, it's absurd. But now, having seen the terrifying collections some people online have, or even how big the studio armies have gotten, it doesn't seem that outrageous. Oh, just 11 tanks? Yeah, that seems pretty reasonable. Once it got to the hobby section, it all starts to get a little military scale modeler, utilising techniques you don't tend to see much on other studio armies but are common when people paint model kits of military vehicles. Interestingly, they even have a nod to the usefulness of historical reference books, showing a book not published by GW, which you don't see often. There was also a lot of conversion work and repurposed minis going on, like this extra wide Russ, or showing that you could use Necromunda minis as guardsmen, something other bits of the book also alluded to the possibility of. Also really digging this custom Sentinel by Warwick Kinraid, which seems to be based on the Space Crusade mission Dreadnought. Dreadnought.
And that was the first 3rd edition Imperial Guard Codex, and it does feel a little different. You see, there were those in GW at the time who had a real love for historical wargaming and military history in general. This is really apparent in the Forge World Imperial armor books, and the fact that there was a whole spin-off Warhammer historical thing that I suppose we should talk about at some point. And here it really feels like they were using the Guard to indulge in those fascinations. From the non-standard structure to the radically different aesthetics of the regiments that were obvious allusions to real-world historical militaries, or at least the pop culture versions of them, it feels like during these earlier editions the creators were having fun trying to make the Guard not only feel unique, but also encouraging you to make your own Guard army full of character, even if, paradoxically, there were more restrictions on how you made them. For example, there's stuff like this designer's note on the hardened veterans that says they're there to allow players to practice their conversion skills, since there are no plans of making minis of many of the options in there. So every hardened veteran squad would be a bespoke thing. I suppose the best way I can put it is, Space Marines may be the poster boys of 40k, but we get the sneaking suspicion that around this time, the Guard were the favourite.
This codex would be expanded with a few supplements during its life, until it was, as previously mentioned, replaced by another Guard codex for the tail end of 3rd edition in 2003. But despite its relatively short shelf life, remember this was back when a faction wasn't guaranteed a new codex each edition unless they were vanilla Marines, these things could stick around for a while. We can't help but pick up some of the fondness for the Guard oozing from this book, and so we like them just a little bit more now than we did before cracking it open.
So, that's nice, isn't it?
Oh, and we'll see you next time. Hey there, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it the old thumbs up and maybe leave us a comment about your favourite type of pasta, just to really confuse the people who turn these videos off the moment the credits start. If you would like to support these videos with cold hard cash, then head over to patreon.com/snipeandwhip. We're actually about to start a new monthly Patreon exclusive video schedule over there. The first one, where I talk about my new 40k Grot Rebellion spin-off army, should hopefully be out by the end of the week. So if that sounds good to you, then check that out. Regardless, hope that 2025 is treating you well so far, although my newsfeed suggests that that is statistically unlikely. So y'all take care of each other.